guys, it's Nicole. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I want to show you different pots that you can use to grow your orchids. So when you're growing indoors, you're trying to mimic what orchids get in the wild. And orchids are epiphytes. They usually grow on trees. They get lots of air to their roots. And in the last video, I showed you guys different materials that you can use to grow your orchids, but there's different kinds of pots that you can use to grow as well. I've used different kinds of pots in the last 10 years of growing, so I have things in different setups, and I'm going to share the pros and cons of using different materials. So let's jump right in. Okay, so the first kind of setup that you can use for your orchid is you could mount your orchid. So I have this orchid here mounted. I've had it mounted for a year. It was kind of rambly. I have it mounted with some sphagnum moss, and this has some pros and cons. So this directly mimics what the orchid gets in the wild, right? Because the roots are exposed. Typically there's moisture because of leaves and stuff like that, and like branches. So this kind of mimics what the orchid gets in the wild. Pros, that's great. So they can grow really well. The cons, you have to water a mounted orchid quite a lot. So I have to water this orchid daily. And watering daily, I really don't enjoy doing that. So it's not my favorite setup, but lots of orchid growers can get away with it, especially in Florida, or if you have humid environments, or if you could just grow outdoors and just hose your orchids off every day, or it rains every day, that's perfect. You can't really overwater this. It's a good setup if you live in those environments that I mentioned, but if you're growing indoors, it's not really feasible. So I prefer pots. So the next sort of pot that you see that's most common are clear pots. So you usually see like slotted pots or pots with holes in them. These are a safe bet because you could really see the roots on your orchid, which is great, right? The downside to this is that these pots tend to be a little bit more expensive. Also, you'll notice with slotted pots, they tend to get roots that grow through them, and it makes repotting very, very difficult. That's just my opinion, but these are great for beginners because then you can monitor to see how your orchid is doing, how it's adapting, especially if it doesn't have that many roots. You could see right through the pot. You could use any material you want. This is best for beginners, I think. Usually they're slotted, they have some holes in them, but they do tend to cost a lot. And in my experience, I just find repotting to be really difficult just because you have roots growing through every single groove and it makes it really hard, right? So not my favorite, even though it's good for beginners, just because I have so many orchids, I've repotted so many, and I've had nightmares trying to repot some stuff. Also, something to keep in mind is that these pots are not, they're not super heavy, right? So you have to get a decorative pot sometimes that's heavier to hold it up, because once they get bigger, they tend to tip over. So that's something else to keep in mind. If you could find clear pots or frosted pots that do not have slits, I recommend them. So this is a frosted pot I got from Repotme. And you could see the roots. It's not completely see-through, but I think this is better than slotted pots because although they give less air, and orchid roots need air, you can manage that with doing chunky mix or something like that. These are good because, I mean, they can be a little pricey too, just because anything that's orchid related seems to cost more money. But this is still a really good option. This is a frosted pot. You could see the roots are growing on the bottom, but because it's not a slotted hole at the bottom, this will be easier to repot. This is the Phalaenopsis tetraspis imperatrix. It's so cute. Frosted pots are really nice. Also, I just realized this has a nice fragrance to it. It's really nice and it matches. Okay, so the next kind of pot you can use, and this is my favorite. This is any regular pot. So this one is in a regular white sturdy pot. I got this on Amazon. I'll link it down below. But this is my Cattleya Richard Mueller by Cattleya labiata. I got this from Michael McCarthy. It's gonna bloom. Upside to this, they're very affordable. They're regular pots. They're not meant just for orchids, which is amazing. Downside to it, you can't see the roots. But once you've been growing for a while, you could use any normal pot, I think. You could even start out that way. Like a lot of nursery pots, they're not clear either. So provided you have a good chunky mix, you know that the orchid roots are getting air, you know that they're growing well. But I would say once you have a handle on orchids, just use regular pots. That could be a good option if you're finding that clear pots are too expensive. They do charge a premium for anything orchid related. That's why I use regular pots. The bigger the pot is, the sturdier it can be. This could be literally anything, a nursery pot. It could be a fancy plain pot. This was about $1. And clear pots could be $2 and they can be tiny. It just makes no sense. So this is an economical option. Downside, you can't really see the roots. Upside, it's cheap. Okay, another super common option is a clay pot. So clay pots are used because they're very wicking and they provide a lot of pretty much air to the roots by way of being very porous. So when I water this is a Vanda. I have it in sphagnum moss. This will dry for me within 2 days. So if you need something that dries quickly, clay pots are really good. So a lot of growers use clay pots exclusively. You could use anything in this. I personally grow my Vandas in clay pots with sphagnum moss now. I just find that Vandas need a lot of moisture, but they need a lot of air. So this is in fluffy moss, and this promotes drying very quickly. The smaller the pot is, the quicker it dries. That is a downside to using clay pots. So when I first started growing, I was using clay pots on my Oncidiums. The Oncidiums would dry super, super, super fast. So that was a downside, and that was really kind of annoying because I had to water every day. But if you have a bigger pot, a bigger orchid, you don't have to water as much. If you are a chronic overwaterer, this will help you too because it will be porous and it will take out that moisture. This is breathable. So it is as if you have holes in this pot almost. Some of the really big clay pots, the 6-inch pots, they have holes in them too. So that also helps. So this is almost like a foolproof way of growing orchids. The downside being that it dries fast, but the upside being that it does promote more wicking and you're not going to suffocate your roots in moisture. You can overwater in clay pots, but it's hard because it is so porous. Another downside to this is that they tend to have algae or minerals that leach out of the pot. So I don't mind it. Some growers do, but some pots get a little nasty and you may want to scrub them down every now and then, but I don't see that as a really bad thing personally. The next kind of pot, I want to say it's my favorite, but my favorite is really just regular pots, but it's these specialty orchid pots. So these pots are great because they're usually quite heavy, they don't tip over, and they're beautiful. Usually they're ceramic or glazed clay. So you could see this one has a lot of holes in it. I have my Vanda in sphagnum moss. This also dries for me within about 2 or 3 days, just because there's so much aeration in here. So I put pretty, very special orchids in this, or something that needs to dry out quickly, I put in these. The upside to these pots is that they're so beautiful. You can show off your orchid really nicely in something like this. And they do really well. This is designed for orchids. You could see just with the holes here, this is going to get lots of air. The downside with these pots is they do dry fast, which is basically a goal of this, to make sure that you're not suffocating the roots. But the biggest downside, in my opinion, is that they're expensive. So a pot like this can easily run you $25. If you have a big collection, it's not feasible to have something like this. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, the last kind of pot is a self-watering pot. So self-watering pots are used a lot of times in a semi-hydro setup, such as this one, where you have Leca, you have a water reservoir, and moisture is wicked up to the roots. This is an always moist system. These pots can be pretty handy if you're not trying to water that much. They do have a water indicator telling you how much water is in there. And once you reach the maximum level, it is the maximum level before touching the orchid roots. There's 2 pots, an outer pot and an inner pot. The water reservoir is on the bottom, and the inner pot does not usually touch the water, but it has a little component that basically wicks up. So the leca at the very, very bottom will wick up. Usually you want to use inorganic media for this, like leca. You can use something like sphagnum moss, but that can get moldy and degrade over time. So I only use sphagnum moss in a self-watering sort of setup if I'm dealing with like a Miltoniopsis or a plant that's really, really thirsty that I cannot keep up with the watering. Then I will add water to the bottom once in a while in the summer. I don't want to keep a pot full of water with organic because then it can get moldy and it's not ideal. But these are great if you have plants that can tolerate a semi-hydro setup. Not all of them do. I've learned that the hard way. So I'm moving away from this setup. But if you don't want to water as much, you may consider a setup like this. Downside to this, not all of the orchids enjoy this setup, and these pots can be kind of expensive. So as I'm moving towards regular pots and moving away from semi-hydro, I may be using these, but not using the water reservoir, just because I'm going to use bark and sphagnum moss, and that's not generally wicking enough. But it's another option. So different pots can work differently in different environments. Some folks who live in Florida love mounting their orchids, and they can just hose their plants all the time. If you grow indoors, you want something that retains more moisture. And the whole goal of growing orchids indoors when you're using pots is to recreate what they get in the wild. So you want to use the right materials, either bark or leca, coconut husk, anything like that. Check out this video here. And you want to use it in conjunction with the right pot that gives the right moisture to air ratio to your orchids. So whether it's a clear slotted pot, whether it's an orchid specific pot, whether it's a regular pot, you can figure it out. Just a bit of trial and error and you'll figure out what works best for you. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye everyone.